Just so everybody's aware, I will also be helping Dr. Nilson with the slides and managing the chat, so she can just worry about teaching to us and her amazing presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Karen Bryson to introduce Dr. Nilson today.
Thank you so much. We had a wonderful morning presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us this afternoon. On behalf of the Ottawa University Faculty Development Committee, I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker in the Roy W. Browning Senior Faculty Development Symposium Series, Dr. Linda B. Nilson. She is Director Emerita of the Office of Teaching Effectiveness and Innovation at Clemson University and the author of Teaching at Its Best, a research-based resource for college instructors. Today, Dr. Nilson will be speaking to us about teaching to how the mind works. I'm so happy to have you with us today, Dr. Nilson.
Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you, Andrea, for being my guardian angel. Oh, we're going to be talking about teaching to how the mind works. Makes life easier for everybody. Makes life easier for you because you get better results, and makes life easier for students because they can learn more naturally, really more easily. Next slide, please. These are the promises of what you're going to be able to do by the end of this webinar. You're going to be able to implement teaching and learning methods and activities that enhance students' deep learning, retention, and retrieval of the material according to cognitive science research. And there's a lot of research out there from cognitive science that really gives meat to the principles I'm going to be talking about today. You're also going to be able to share these principles with your students to help them learn how to learn. We all have minds and we don't know how they work. Unless we're majoring in or have a PhD in cognitive psychology, we really don't know. And the more familiar we can make our students with the way their mind operates, the easier their entire lives will be, because they're going to have to be learning how to learn on their own a great deal in life. They're going to have to keep up with their field, and they're also going to have to probably tool up for a new career after their career runs its course. So probably going to happen. Okay, next slide. And this is the way I've organized this webinar. I'm going to talk about 20 principles of learning and cognition, and then sort of like the pass the baton to you to do your homework, to think about how you can apply each of these principles in designing and teaching your own courses and in teaching your students how to learn. These principles are just as applicable to online courses as they are to face-to-face courses. It's just that when you're dealing with an online course, it's certainly asynchronous, that what you have to do is you have to take activities that aren't writing activities in themselves and turn them into writing activities, because writing is a main way that students communicate with you and they communicate with each other, and to a certain extent how you communicate with students. But you're also dealing with other media as well, in that you can assign your students videos and podcasts. You can make your own videos. You could draw videos off the web. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. But, you know, when in doubt, try to convert whatever the principles I'm talking about into something written for your students to do. Next slide, please. And this is the way I'm going to lay out these principles. Before each principle, you think about these words. Students learn new material better and remember it longer when. And so that's how we're going to introduce it. But I might just shorten it to students learn better when. So let's look at the first principle. Students learn better when they learn the steps of a process or procedure in the same order that they will be performing them. Now you figure, well, of course, why not? Well, because some people do it differently or have done it differently, and it hasn't been as effective. As in, okay, we've got 10 steps to this procedure. Let's learn the easiest steps first. That might make sense, but it's not as good in terms of teaching and learning. So always teach those steps, have students learn the steps in the order that they're going to be using those steps, performing those steps. Okay, principle number 2 in the next slide. Students learn better when they actively plan, monitor, and evaluate their learning of the material. This is called self-regulated learning. And so that is, what are students actually doing? Well, they're observing their cognitive processing, that is, their thinking, metacognition, thinking about their thinking. They're observing their emotional reactions, particularly their emotional reactions of any resistance to the new knowledge that they're gaining, because if they do have emotional resistance, that new knowledge will not stick. It'll disappear rather quickly. So, but if they're aware of those emotional reactions and they can say, okay, I'm resisting this, I've got to suspend judgment, I've got to try this theory or explanation, whatever, got to try it on for size. Okay. And students also have to observe the effectiveness of different learning environments. Some will be more effective for some people more than others. And for example, there are people who learn and write best in coffee shops with that kind of gentle white noise in the background. There are a few students who learn best when they are listening to predictable music. Some students learn best when they are listening to classical music. A lot of students, most students actually, learn best when there's no sound or stimulation at all, when they're in like a soundproof booth, when they're in the library. So most students, again, work best when it's quiet. Students differ in terms of, what's the best amount of coffee to have beforehand. What's the optimal amount of sleep? What's the best time of day to study? Because there are some people who are night owls and they study better later in the evening. And, the temperature in the room, sometimes even the color of the walls. Pink, for instance, is stimulating, which can be, very good for some people, and other people want something more mellow, like green or blue. There are all kinds of differences in learning environment. Some people can have their mobile devices next to them and not be tempted to go to them. Other students need their mobile devices in another room entirely, and preferably turned off so they don't make any noise at all, like bing, bing, none of that. So, but students have to experiment with the best learning environment for them, and they might not know that. And we have to tell them to experiment. Okay, next principle. Students learn best when they engage in an activity of some sort, whether they're engaging in it on their own, alone, or in a small group, or the whole class, versus passively watching or listening to you, whether you be live or recorded, for an extended period of time. When an extended period of time, when I'm looking here for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, it really depends on your demonstrated enthusiasm and your public speaking skills as to how long you might be able to hold their attention. But in any case, students learn best by doing in one way, shape, or form. Even if the doing just might be like discussing, or it might be writing, or it might be speaking. One of these things where students really have to be engaged in the moment of learning. Next one, please. Now, this brings us to the issue of lecture. I am not anti-lecture. A lot of people out there may be, but a lecture serves a purpose. As long as it doesn't go on too long, it can serve some very good purposes. For instance, if you are expressive, if you demonstrate your enthusiasm, that you can get students more interested in the material. Enthusiasm is contagious, right? So it's a good idea to use a lecture to, let's say, introduce a topic and to draw students into it. In a good lecture, you can model a form of reasoning, a form of problem solving, critical thinking, a style of speaking, all kinds of good things that you can model in a lecture. It's just that you can't just leave it there, and students have to do it. A good lecture also can tailor the organization to fit the organization of the course, fit the organization of the particular class meeting, if you're meeting, or tailor just the organization that you've gotten your students used to dealing with, to following. So anyway, so it's good for organizational differences where you might not be able to find that kind of good organization in print material. A good lecture, it can be the best way for you to adapt high-level material to your students' level. It might be the best way for you to present a background summary. Can't find one in print? Do a relatively brief lecture on it. And a lecture can be the best, sometimes the only way, to update the material. Like, you just read this in this journal and you want to share this with your students. This is the best way to do it. This is the quickest way to do it, to get this new knowledge onto the course forum. Next slide, please. But here's what lecture alone can't help students do: to examine and possibly change their attitudes. Lecture isn't good that way. Discussion is very good that way, by the way, especially when students are listening to each other exchange opinions. Students put a lot of credence in each other, sometimes more credence than they put in us. Lecture alone can't help students explore controversial material. Again, discussion's wonderful for that. Let's say videos presenting different sides of the story, different sides of a debate, that's very good, or podcast, something like that, but not necessarily our lecturing. Lecture alone can't help students learn how to transfer knowledge to new situations. What you have to do is you have to put students in new situations, or get them involved in new situations, like get them involved in new cases, new problem-solving situations. So that's how students learn how to do the transfer, by transferring it, by trying to transfer it. And they might have to try several times before they're getting it really on course. Lecture alone can't help students develop or improve a bunch of skills, as in critical thinking, or problem solving, or writing, or speaking, or performance or procedural techniques. Students have to do these things, practice doing these things, and after practicing, to get some sort of feedback about how well they have been performing these tasks, how well they've been practicing these skills, so they can get better at it the next time. But they have to be doing these things. You can model the critical thinking, you can model the speaking, you can give students great examples of the writing, but then they have to do these things themselves. And of course, you will realize that nobody has ever learned how to play the violin by watching somebody else play the violin. It's just not the way it works. Students have to do it themselves. And lecture does not help students retain knowledge for very long, not lecture alone. And this gets us back to the doing. When students do whatever the thing is, when they're engaged in doing it, then it becomes part of their life experience. And if there's one thing that we tend to remember pretty well, it's our life experience. So, next slide, please. In addition to choosing lecture carefully and looking at the purposes for lecture and the purposes that lecture does not alone serve very well, is we need to practice interactive lecturing, which means we lecture for maybe 10, 20 minutes or so. It depends upon the material, of course. And then we give students a break, but an activity break, for them to work with the material in some way. This interactive lecturing compensates for short attention spans, since students don't do a very good job of listening to you for long periods of time. Interactive lecturing tends to increase class attendance. It definitely increases learning, plenty of research on that, and retention of the material, which is what we want. It can even raise your student ratings, because students enjoy these student active breaks. This works online as well, because what you can do is you can give your 5-6 minute lecture and then give students something to do on a discussion board. You just have to hold them responsible for doing it. So some sort of question to answer, or possibly a group activity to do that has to do with what you were just talking about, because with online learning, the lectures have to be very, very short. 10 minutes online, that's pushing it. I've heard as short as 3 minutes, but that's kind of, what can we say in 3 minutes? But we do have to limit it to 5-6 minutes, maybe 7. That's pushing it a little bit. Next slide, please. There are plenty of options for these break activities, and I'm just going to give you just a few examples so you can get very creative. And these options involve either the individuals doing it on their own, or they're doing it in pairs, or they're doing it in small groups. For instance, and this is something that normally is done only in a classroom, is periodic free recall, written free recall of your mini lecture, what you were just talking about. Works great, by the way, if students aren't taking notes and you wish they would. So you tell students in advance, I'm going to be speaking for 15 minutes, and then I'm going to stop, and I'm going to ask you to recall everything you can and write it down, but leave space between the things that you write down. Why? Because after they are finished doing this writing, that then they will work individually, and then they'll work in pairs to fill in the holes. This does not take as long as you might fear. This might take 3 minutes. Most of these breaks take 2 minutes to 10 minutes. So it doesn't have to soak up all your class time, and certainly not all your online time. You can poll students' opinions or experiences. You can give students a quick case study, and if you're relying on the case method, this is a great way to get students used to it. You can have students discuss an open-ended question. Next slide, please. In small groups or as a class. You can have students work on a difficult or complex issue and try to reach consensus on it, or reach a conclusion on it. So, this again is something that you might want to do in class, but you can do this online as well in small groups. You can have students list examples of a concept that you've been talking about. You can have them do a 1-sentence or maybe 2-sentence summary of what you were talking about, or the video that you showed them, or the demonstration that they watched. You could have students recast the content that you were talking about, or that they got it on a video or on a podcast, as a graphic, as a visual. And these are some examples of visuals like flowcharts, concept maps, and things. But I'm going to be talking more about visuals later on, so you're going to see what some of these types of graphics actually look like. Next slide, please. You can give students a faulty problem solution and have them find the error and correct it. You can have them support a statement. You can have them solve a problem. You can have them fill in a worksheet. You can have them, here's a cool one, invent or write questions for future tests. Now remember, you've got to train, writing questions for tests are not easy, right? It took us years to get good at it, and nobody taught us how to do it, most likely. But you can teach your students how to write test questions before they actually are doing it for you as an assignment. First of all, you can tell them that different levels of cognitive operations, as in the way Bloom does it. So higher level ones are application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And so you can say, okay, students, I want you to write a question that is either evaluative or synthesis, or otherwise known as creation. So you have them, write a question that way, and be sure you have some believable options, wrong answer options, and try to make them the same length as the right answer and this sort of thing. So they'll start to realize that there is a real art form to writing test questions, especially like multiple choice. Those are difficult ones to write, or multiple true false. Those aren't that much easier. And you can get these questions, you can tweak them, you can particularly tweak the false options, the wrong answers. They might need some tweaking. But believe me, students are going to be motivated to do a great job on this for you because they want you to pick their questions for the future test because they know the answers to their questions, right? They made up those questions. This makes for a great small group activity. Absolutely wonderful. And you can have students do this online for you. Now, you might not want them to do it on a discussion board so students don't take each other's questions. This might make for a good assignment that's emailed to you or otherwise shared with you in private. You can have students write reaction or reflection paragraphs to the material that you've been talking about or the video that they saw or what have you. Perhaps the most useful material, the most important, the most surprising, the material that they understood the least, otherwise known as the muddiest point. And then that will give you valuable information as well as to what you might want to review with them using different wording or different examples. Next slide, please. Okay, principle number 4. We were talking before about giving students practice with feedback. Well, this is the sort of feedback that students really need and really learn from. Targeted feedback, that is feedback that's targeted on how they can improve their performance the next time they practice it. However, when we give feedback, targeted or otherwise, we are assuming that they are reading the feedback and processing it and accurately interpreting that feedback. And sometimes that assumption that we make is wrong. They don't always read it, they don't always process it, they don't always interpret it accurately. Next slide, please. So, what's an instructor to do? Well, one thing from the very beginning, you can have a follow-up assignment, and this works very, very well with papers or designs or projects. You've given them back whatever the paper is, and let's say it's a paper. Because what do they'll tend to do? They'll tend to just, go to the last page, see what grade you gave them, read the last paragraph, and then drop it in their circular file. No. You want them to go through that feedback and summarize it back to you. Summarize it back to you. Then they'll read it, and then you'll be able to find out how they interpreted it. When students misinterpret your feedback or otherwise just seem to not be paying proper attention to it, you can clarify your standards. You can give them more modeling, more modeling experiences, or you can give them feedback with new information or using different terminology. Sometimes students will simply blow off your feedback because they don't agree with it. And this happens a lot in writing because they figure, okay, you're helping me to write better. Yeah, but I've been writing this way all my life. And I've been communicating in the ways I wanted to communicate with the people I wanted to communicate. So what's the problem? And so they might reject your feedback on the basis of their own personal experience. And this is where you need to enlist other students to help. And there will be students there who do communicate more clearly than other students and can say, no, I was out in the real world for a while and I did writing, and I had to learn to write very clearly for a large number of people, and the best way to do it is to do it in this particular way with this sort of sentence structure. Next slide, please. Now, under principle number 5, students learn better when they relate the new material to their prior knowledge about it. However, this works best when their prior knowledge about it is valid and it's organized knowledge as well. It's organized in a valid way, and the knowledge is in itself valid. And because the problem is when, let's say, your students have a faulty mental model, that your good knowledge won't hook onto it very well. And they will simply cling to their faulty mental model, and your new knowledge will slip right off because it doesn't fit with their current mental model. So, next principle, principle number 6, what we need to do is to help students learn better is to be sure when students have or might have a faulty mental model, and we can find this out by asking them what their mental model is, they'll tell us, that the new material is challenging their current mental models, their faulty mental models, that is creating conflicts in their thinking or contradictions or anomalies or uncertainties or ambiguities. In any case, their model is failing and not looking as good as your model does. Then they're curious. Then they might start questioning their faulty model. They might start wanting to solve this problem and start to reason so they can restore their cognitive equilibrium. We are all driven to have cognitive equilibrium. So when things are out of balance, things aren't right, we have this model, but we've had this model, but it seems to be breaking down. It's not doing a good job of accommodating these particular examples or accommodating this case or accommodating the story, what have you. Well, gee, this is when students become uncomfortable. And when students become uncomfortable, mildly uncomfortable anyway, this is good. This is good because they realize they're in cognitive equilibrium and they want to restore that equilibrium. So then they're more open to your model and more open to abandoning their faulty mental model. Students often come into classes not only with faulty mental models about how things happen, but also with faulty mental models about what their career might be like. So a lot of students will go into the health professions or the allied health fields because of material they've seen on television. And that sort of glorifies what that occupation might involve. Or students used to come into my sociology classes, since that was my background, especially intro classes, thinking that, well, anything that happens to a person is due to that own individual's actions or inactions. And that's not what sociology is built on at all. It's not true. there is an invisible thing out there called the social structure that will stack the odds for or against you to wind up in a certain future, wind up in a certain occupation, wind up in a certain educational level. It depends on your socioeconomic background or class background, as it's sometimes said. And when students really have to understand that to make a gestalt so they can understand sociology. So they come in with a faulty mental model, and hopefully they leave with a corrected mental model that accommodates the social structure. Next one, please. This is principle number 7. Students learn better when they practice what's called elaborative rehearsal, which is a fancy cognitive psychology term for thinking about the material's meaning and importance and its connection to their prior knowledge, beliefs, and mental models. This kind of thinking is how we move new material from our working memory when it first comes in and we're thinking, that's interesting. We're first trying to understand it, first trying to process it. When we move it into our long-term memory, it doesn't go seamlessly from our working memory and our long-term memory. No. We have to think about it. We have to think about the meaning, importance, or connection to prior knowledge, beliefs, and mental models. So when you are teaching something that you know is quite new to your students, you need to give them some sort of an exercise, some sort of a question on a discussion board to, let's say, like, okay, how does this connect to what you already know about this subject matter, or what you think you know about this subject matter, or what you've learned in the past about it, and get students to consciously make that connection to their prior knowledge and beliefs or mental models, because otherwise they might miss that opportunity. And then what happens to that new knowledge is it goes away. It's called, the technical term is called decays. It decays very, very quickly and never gets into that long-term memory, which is what we call learning, getting that knowledge into our long-term memory, not just passing through our working memory and disappearing into thin air. And the next slide, please. Principle number 8, and this is obvious, but students learn better when they're paying attention to the new material and when they're focusing on the new material. Of course. When they're attending to anything else, that new material isn't even getting into the working memory. It's getting nowhere. But then we also have to get students not only to attend in the moment, but to focus on the material for periods of time. So what are some of the things that attract and hold students' focus? Well, human faces. If you are teaching online, you should be using technology, the kind of technology we're using now, where my face speaking is at least in a corner of the screen, and you might have, let's say, like PowerPoint slides or something else, or a picture or a graphic that you're explaining, a photograph, a model, what have you, in maybe the main part of the screen, or it can be reversed for that matter. But human faces attract and hold students' attention, and this is something that is true of infants. 3-month-old infants track human faces. As soon as they can see, they are watching human faces, especially their mother's human face, because that's what they see most of the time, or whoever is functioning as a mother in that situation. But human faces, again, this was very adaptive for us. This was a survival strategy for us. And this human faces, that helps make us into humans. It help us understand what emotions are. Another thing that attracts and holds student attention, color. Color, more so than black and white. And intensity. This means particularly, let's say, with respect to color, this means like brighter colors, or extreme contrast, colors that are like black and white, or let's say like gold or yellow on dark blue. Those are extreme contrast. But there are also different kinds of intensities in extreme contrast. There is, for instance, emotional intensity. Of a presentation, for instance, it's something that will always attract attention. And I'm going to be talking about emotions and emotional intensity and how powerful a learning device that is later on in this presentation. But you've got intensity. Intensity is also displayed by the intensity we show in our excitement about the material. Extreme contrast, yes, we can, be talking about color, what have you. But we can also be talking about contrast in terms of opinions. You might have something like dueling videos, where one video is giving one point of view and the other video is giving another point of view. A debate is extreme contrast, and those tend to be memorable experiences. Debate, by the way, is one of the best ways to teach critical thinking. Movement and change. Our eyes, our attention will track movement and change. Again, highly adaptive for us, helped us survive when we were on the savannah or in the jungle, whatever. If we were missing movement out there, we might be somebody else's dinner, right? We've got to be very aware of what's going on around us, particularly changes in what's going on around us. Drama. Drama is a kind of intense experience, and drama comes, in many, many different forms. You can have a demonstration that's dramatic. I can still remember from my Physics for Poets course as an undergraduate, some of the demonstrations that this professor did in class. Little explosions and toys going across the room. These sorts of, we might consider silly things. Hey, it was dramatic, and I can remember them to this day. Personal relevance is another factor. Students attend to what they believe is relevant to their own lives. It might be relevant to their own lives now, or it might be relevant to the lives that they envision for themselves in the near future or the farther future. But in any case, they have to see it as relevant. And when they see it as relevant, they perk up. We might have to explain to them the relevance of a certain lesson. And then they might perk up. If we didn't explain it, they might not, because they might not realize the relevance to them, particularly in their future. Again, they're going for a certain career, but they have limited knowledge about what that career might be like. We've got more knowledge. We have to explain to them how they will be using this knowledge, how they'll be using this information, how they'll be needing it in the future. And then our own enthusiasm and solid public speaking skills attract students' attention and holds their focus as well. As I said, enthusiasm is contagious. And good public speaking skills involve enthusiasm, but also involve other techniques that tend to attract attention. Gesturing, for instance, movement around the room. Now, unfortunately, when you're dealing with an online teaching setting, your movement is highly restricted. And you can't just send students your 50-minute lecture that you did in class, that, moving around there. That won't work. And then it takes a certain kind of technology to even track your movement beyond just your head movements or some gestures. Next slide, please. Which brings us to distractions, in particular digital distractions these days, but all kinds of distractions that are out there. Distractions are our enemy. They interfere with students' attention, the process of elaborative rehearsal, that is thinking about the material, the process of encoding which takes material that we receive, and puts it into a form that the brain can use, with the process of storage of the material and retrieval of the material. Every learning process we can think of, every aspect of it is interfered with by distractions. We know from a mountain of research, students don't know this, but we know this, and students need to know, that digital distractions reduce their attention span. So it actually shortens their attention span because of all this material. They get used to information coming at them at not Mach speed, right? And that's simply not the way most of the world works. So it reduces their attention span. Of course, it reduces their focus. It stops their focus. It reduces their engagement. It reduces their learning, and it reduces their grades. Yes, their grades are sacrificed due to digital distractions. And this is why in certainly a face-to-face classroom, that faculty members will generally, often most faculty members, will restrict the use of digital devices, whether it be the mobile devices or laptops. Now, laptops are a lot easier to manage. You can work with laptops in class a little bit more effectively, because first of all, you're you're more likely to be able to see if they have their laptop open when they shouldn't have their laptop open. But if you're going to have students working in class on their laptops, it's a really smart idea to have 3 students to a laptop working on whether it be some kind of a problem that they're solving or a worksheet that they're completing, what have you. Have 3 to a laptop, because they're not likely to be able to agree on a renegade site. So that helps them control their temptations. Now, students say, well, I can multitask. And they don't even know what multitasking really is. Multitasking, when we're talking about in the context of the classroom versus their digital devices or whatever they might be doing homework for another course for all we know. What students are actually doing is task switching, rotating between tasks. Because when we're talking about what we're doing on digital devices and what's going on in a classroom, whether it be activities or you're doing a mini lecture, what have you, those activities are competing for the same mental resources. They're using the same parts of our brain. And guess what? Our brain's limited. Our minds are limited. We can't do 2 things at once with the same part of our brain. Now, there are some things we can do at the same time, and we can do them quite effectively, but they're using different parts of our brains. For instance, we can, run and talk to our running partner at the same time. That's pretty easy to do and very understandable. We are using different parts of our brain. We can cook and listen to music at the same time. No problem there. We're using different parts of our brain. But that's the only kind of multitasking we can do effectively. Next slide, please. Trying to multitask using the same parts of our brains, so doing task rotation, is very stressful for us and is highly inefficient. We are more likely to make mistakes, and we take longer to do the same tasks. I've given you some URLs here, some websites here that you can send your students to. They don't believe you, maybe they'll believe these sites where they're based on research of people trying to multitask in different contexts. The last one, multitasking while trying to fly an airplane, that gets really ugly really quickly. So it's not just a matter of, oh, it's stressful and it's inefficient. It costs lives. And of course, pilots have tried to do this, of course. Next slide, please. Okay, principle number 9. Students learn better when they are tested. Really, the nicest thing we can do for our students is to give them a quiz. They don't think so, but it is. Well, so students are tested or they test themselves on the material versus this rereading it, even multiple times. And the power of testing or testing oneself is called the testing effect. Unfortunately, that rereading it, that's a student's default mechanism because they don't know about self-testing. Again, they don't know how their mind works. And so, you know, they don't know enough to stop rereading. That's a waste of time, really a waste of time compared to self-testing. Being tested or self-testing makes us engage in what's called retrieval practice. And it's a desirable difficulty. And I'm going to talk about desirable difficulties later. But hey, rereading material, that's pretty easy. And we look at it, we say, oh yeah, I remember that when I read it before, blah, blah, blah. Well, again, doesn't work for learning, doesn't work even for studying for an exam. But retrieval practice is very good because the more times you retrieve a certain piece of knowledge or piece of information, the easier it is to retrieve it next time. So if you get involved in retrieval practice while you're studying for exam, chances are it's going to be a lot easier to retrieve that knowledge or information during the exam. There has been so much research done on this principle. And I will just tell you about one of the studies that was done. Students, I should say subjects in the experiment, some of them were students, were given some lay material. It happened to be history, but it was written in lay language, non-technical language, to read, to learn, and they were divided into 2 groups. There was one group that was told to reread the material as many times as they could in the time in which they were given. And then there was another group that was given the material for self-testing. Let's go to the next slide. This was the technique that they were told to use, the self-testing technique. They were told to read the material, then recall as much of the material as they could, and then to go back and review the reading for what they might have misunderstood or might have forgot, and then to recall that again. In other words, these were like flashcards. So this was a self-regulated learning technique, what's called a reading wrap, or called the 3 R's. So this technique was tested against rereading even many times. So again, given the same amount of time, the subjects that were told to just reread the material on the average of 16 times in that slot. Now you'd think after 16 times they will have memorized the material, right? And then the self-testing group, the read, recall, review group, they, in that period of time, they did this procedure an average of 3.5 times. 2 weeks later, the subjects are brought back into the experiment, and they are given a multiple choice test, an objective test anyway, on the material. And they didn't study it in between. They might have, forgotten they ever even did the experiment. And so anyway, so how did these 2 groups do? Well, the reread group got a score of about 40 on the average on this test, while the self-regulated learning reading wrap group, 3 R's group, read, recall, review group, got an average of 60% on this particular test on this material. Again, no previous study, just from what they'd done 2 weeks before. And that's important. That's very important because they did, the Read, Recall, Review group did so much better in the same amount of time. You don't have to do things 3.5 times, by the way. If you're just doing a reading, you're just studying a reading, just going through this self-testing procedure once will help a great deal. And then you go through it again when you're studying for the test. So this is the way to teach your students to read material. Tell them to read a section or read the whole chapter, whatever, then to put away the book, put away their notes, then recall all they can, either reciting it aloud or writing it down, and then to go back and review the chapter for what they misunderstood or what they forgot, and to recall that. Way more effective. Tell them so. Tell them plenty of experimental research backs up this claim. And again, it's more efficient. It's as efficient, it's as effective as taking notes. But you know, it takes longer to take notes. This is quicker than taking notes. So it's a great technique. Next slide, please. Okay, principle number 10. Students learn material better when they review or practice it at multiple intervallic times versus reviewing it all at one time, otherwise known as cramming. I mean by multiple intervallic times. That is maybe every few days when they review or practice the material, practice the procedure, what have you, but spaced. It's called spaced practice or distributed practice, and it can take the form of self-testing or being tested. So it can be very good. So in other words, you have a reading that is due, let's say on a Tuesday, and you figure that maybe students did the readings the night before. Well, you know when the best time to test them is, to quiz them on it, is not Tuesday morning, but maybe on Wednesday or Thursday. Spacing that practice, spacing their practice, they said their retrieval practice. So this is a good way to have students do it versus cramming. Cramming, what you do with that is you can remember the material for a short period of time. Now, for some students, they figure, hey, I can remember this for 12 hours and that's all I need. So I'm going to study it, you know, I don't know what, middle of the night, and I'll be able to remember it for the test. Yep, and then 3 hours later, as short as 3 hours later, it can be gone. So it's not very effective for learning, and certainly when students are studying for a later exam where that might cover this material, perhaps the final exam, they're going to look at that material and say, gosh, when did I don't remember learning this before. That's what cramming does, highly inefficient. So anyway, yes, intervallic time is the way to learn material. We probably know this ourselves when we are, let's say, getting ready to present something at a conference, that we know that if we go over it every other day for a while before the conference, that we'll be in great shape versus going over it multiple times when we're in the plane flying to the conference, right? So we've had some experience with this. The next slide, please. Relatedly, students learn better when that review or practice is interleaved versus blocked. That is when you are having students review earlier material as they are learning new material. Not generally the way we teach. Generally, we teach, let's say we're teaching math. We have a chapter. We say, okay, do all the problems at the end of the chapter. And then we drop that topic for a while. And then we go to another chapter the next week. We have them do all the problems, whatever. And then we drop it and so forth. Okay, the better way to do it for our students' sake is to have students do some of the old problems. In other words, they didn't do all these problems when they first read the chapter. You saved some of the problems, maybe 3 of the problems, to scatter throughout the term. So they get used to recognizing and identifying different kinds of problems, which is what they're going to have to do on the test. But they're going to need practice at that. So that's principle 11, and it spaces practice, but it also interleaves the practice. Next slide, please. Principle 12, students learn material better when they expect a final comprehensive exam. That includes it. We might not like the idea of giving a comprehensive exam, but guess what? Students learn material better when they know there's a final comprehensive exam coming up. Next slide, please. Principle number 13, students learn material better when they receive material multiple times and in different ways. You know, a lot of this has to do with repetition and practice, doesn't it? That is, when students receive the material through multiple senses and in multiple modes, because those multiple modes and senses are using different parts of their brain, versus getting the material just once or multiple times in the same way. So, you know, that's just as if that's just like rereading, reread. That just won't work very well at all, because we're using the same part of our brain, doing the same sort of thing, and practicing the material in the same way. Very inefficient. Now, when we're talking about multiple senses and multiple modes, we are not talking here about learning styles. Unfortunately, not to break your heart, but there's no such thing as learning styles. And what we found that out because people started doing experiments on subjects where subjects were taught certain material in their learning style, supposedly their learning style, according to whatever test they took, because there were 77 different models of learning styles out there, so maybe even more as I speak. But anyway, they were taught in their learning style, and then, you know, later on tested on it, or they were taught in a totally different learning style, not part of their learning style at all. And you know what? They did just as well being taught in some other learning style than in what they identified as their own learning style. So learning styles do not seem to exist. So this sounds like, what, I have to go through the material again and again and again? No, usually this is pretty easy, and a lot of us have been doing it anyway. Next slide, please. Okay, learning modes. If students first learn the material one way, okay, so let's say they're like reading or listening or handling models or discussing or doing formal presentations, writing, experiencing or acting, as in a role play or a simulation, or game playing, and some simulations are a little bit like games, or drawing, doing visuals of the material. So if they're first learning the material this way, and usually it's through readings, but not always, then next slide, please. Then ensure that students go over the material in one or two different ways. So you assign a reading. This is easy to do. You assign a reading, students come into class. And this works online as well. Students are given an assignment after they read. Maybe it's a writing assignment. So maybe, let's say if they're coming into class, what they do is you give them a thought question that it requires the readings to do. And so they do a free write answer using the material in the chapter, let's say, that they read. And then you have them break into groups and discuss the material, perhaps share what they wrote down in the free write, or discuss some other question having to do with the material that they read. So already you've touched on 3 different ways, and you probably didn't really have to rearrange class a whole bunch for them to do this. And the thing is, there's the issue with online learning is it relies so much on reading and writing that we need to integrate more watching in there too, perhaps podcasts as well as videos and animation, this sort of thing. So students are using different modes. Students are getting the material in different modes. Next slide, please. Okay, principle number 14. Students learn better when the instruction minimizes cognitive load. Cognitive load being a fancy cognitive psychology term for the demands placed on working memory. Working memory is the first place where new material, or any kind of material, really, or new information goes. But working memory has a very limited capacity to hold information. We can't hold a lot of information in working memory at one time. So we can't introduce too much new material or new information to our students at one time. There was some experiments done, this was decades ago, that found that working memory can hold 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information at one time. And that's it. That's it. So we can't introduce too much at one time, or it simply falls out of working memory. And it never has a chance of getting into longer term memory at all. Never has a chance of being processed or being thought about in any way, shape, or form. So now people have disputed, whether it's 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. So there have been some disputes about that, and we needn't get into that. The idea is that working memory has very limited capacity. And I guess the greatest violator of the demands placed on working memory tends to be in the sciences, because a lot of material is thrown at students at once in the sciences, or in very limited periods of time, where students are having to process too much at one time. And this, of course, makes them simply memorize the material rather than thinking about it, because they just don't have the mental capacity for thinking about it, for doing really more than trying to memorize it at one time. Next slide, please. I want to give you an illustration of this, and you might have the slides in front of you as well. Look at this list of words. What if you were asked to learn this list of words versus, the next slide, this list of words? Which way would be easier? And look at both lists of words, particularly look at this list of words. And you might begin to figure out that, gee, in this organization of the words in each column have something in common. They are grouped. They are in categories. And the first one, like, hey, pieces of furniture, right? This first one, there's no organization to them at all. In the next list of words, there is organization. So this would be much easier to learn. Why? Next slide, please. Because they were chunked. They were categorized. So what we can do to help students learn more at one time is to take all the little bits of knowledge and to categorize them into larger groups of these bits. So what they are more meaningful bits, and they contain more knowledge inside of the categories. And here we're playing on our ability to do pattern recognition. So that's what chunking knowledge is all about, based on pattern recognition. You can have students do the chunking, or we can chunk the knowledge for them. Another way to minimize cognitive load is to use visuals, to give students visuals, or to have them develop visuals themselves. Next slide, please. Visuals or graphics. And this is the power of them. First of all, when students make the visuals themselves, of course, they have to be ready to do this, is they are integrating, organizing, and structuring the knowledge on their own. This leads to deeper learning, more conceptual learning, conceptual understanding, which is deeper learning, longer term retention, and easier retrieval. This is really how we carry our discipline in our heads and remember our discipline. We have organized and structured the knowledge of our discipline really on our own. Maybe we got some help along the way, maybe not. And generally, what we have in our heads are sort of these vague visuals in the way we have organized or structured the knowledge of our discipline. It might be hierarchical. Lots of disciplines are best organized in a hierarchical way. At least we start with hierarchy. But we might have, processes, visuals of, let's say, flowcharts within our big hierarchical visual inside our head. It's a vague visual, true. But this is how we can retain it. This is how we walk around with it without worrying about it, without always using all the pieces of it. Next slide, please. But visuals in general put lower cognitive demands on students' brains, whether they have developed the visual, because developing the visual does, can take a lot of thinking. It's a desirable difficulty, right? But we can also give our students visuals. And when students are working with visuals, more of their mind is free to think about the material or to think beyond the material, make comparisons and inferences, for instance. In addition, the mind photographs the shape of visuals effortlessly. We don't even have to do this consciously. The mind does it for us. And this is how it cues text and details. If we think of the visual, we will often be able to fill in, let's say, the missing words in them, or fill in the cells in a matrix, fill in the details. And I'm sure we've all done this, because we probably have been in, when we were undergraduates, maybe graduates as well, graduate students as well, that we had a test in front of us and we couldn't remember some certain knowledge that we needed for the test. And so we thought of the layout of the page in the textbook where we learned that material. And we thought, okay, it's 2 columns, and okay, the material that I want was in the middle of the 2nd column, and we could almost read it. And we did not sit around and memorize the layout of any of the pages in our textbooks. We just remembered it, and then it helps us remember the text. Next slide, please. This is a concept map. This is a certain kind of visual that's particularly good for hierarchical material. It needn't be symmetrical like this in any way, shape, or form. It usually isn't. This is just a mock-up of it. Next slide, please, which is slide of a mind map, which is really very similar to a concept map. It too is amenable, most amenable to hierarchical material. Next slide, please. Flow chart. This is perfect for sequencing events or parts of an operation or parts of a process, causal, procedural, whatever. Next slide, please. This is a picture of a cycle. We can read about a cycle, but if we can put it in a cyclical visual, we can remember it more easily. Next slide, please. A matrix, which is great for material for comparing and contrasting, or for classifying types of whatever. And this is simply an example out of relatively modern American history having to do with wars. This is great, by the way, for getting students to review before an exam where they have to put a lot of knowledge together. And what all students have to do on the test is remember that this knowledge that they might be interested in retrieving is in this sort of a matrix. And if they did their homework and they did fill in the cells, they can almost read what's in the cells from remembering that this isn't the matrix. Next slide, please. There are concept circle diagrams. Venn diagram is one type of diagram that shows relationships among concepts and categories and equations and topics and principles and things, not just the Venn diagram sort of style that we might have seen in the past that's on our left, but really any types of diagrams. And what these diagrams are showing, and what the overlap is showing, showing examples or cases or observations that these different concepts or categories or equations, whatever, have in common. Next slide, please. Principle number 15. Students learn better when they have to work harder to learn material, which means to overcome desirable difficulties, because desirable difficulties will generate multiple retrieval paths and will stretch students' abilities. Next slide. Desirable difficulties are not to be confused with too much cognitive load, because too much cognitive load will interfere with processing. A desirable difficulty does not. Give you some examples of desirable difficulties. For instance, when you have students take handwritten notes on a chapter, students might not enjoy doing this, but it slows students down. It slows students down and really helps their processing. So if they slow down, they can process more. Requiring students to write written reflections on the material, on the reading material perhaps, or a podcast or video, slows students down, makes them think about the material. Giving small groups particularly creative or difficult or challenging tasks, it's a desirable difficulty as long as the students are able in a group, two heads are better than one, of course, to solve the problem or do whatever the task requires. Having students recast text material as a graphic or visual, also a desirable difficulty, because students really, really have to process the material more deeply. So keep these ideas of cognitive load and desirable difficulty separate. Next slide, please. Students learn material better when they get the material in an organized structure, or if they are ready, if they're more advanced students, to organize it or structure it themselves. What's important here is that students get a coherent big picture. The big picture, again, visuals will help. Oftentimes our big picture is in the form, or can take the form, of a visual. It organizes everything for us. But that big picture is very, very helpful for our memory. And again, with our disciplines, we know that. We have a big picture of our discipline inside of our head. Generally, most students at the undergraduate level might not be able to organize everything that you're telling them in a certain course on their own. It might be a good idea for you to give them that organized structure. They will remember the material better. Next slide, please. Principle number 17, students learn material better when it is connected to easy to understand stories and varied examples. Our brain is hardwired for stories or parables. Parables are simply stories that illustrate general principles. Cases are stories that illustrate more general applications of the material. Parables are oftentimes are examples of certain principles. So varied examples are often shown by stories, but we must remember that culture was carried down before we invented writing, before we invented reading, which is really relatively recently. So for really tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, we carried down culture in stories. We carried down the history of whatever our main group was in stories. We carried down our belief systems in stories. And that's how we remembered things. And they got carried down for a long, long time before we ever decided to write them down. And, you know, remember Homer's stories? Those stories were not originally written at all. They were shared orally in poetry. That was even better. But they were the same stories, just put in a poetic format. God knows how long these stories go back. So anyway, so we should use stories, parables, again, cases. Cases are just stories. Next slide, please. Principle number 18, students learn material better when that material evokes emotions, because emotions bring in the limbic system, not just the cognitive system, into the process. And the limbic system adds neurotransmitters to the learning process, which, you know, the more neurotransmitters, the better, because learning from a brain's point of view is strictly strengthening new synaptic connections or weak synaptic connections. That's what neurotransmitters do. It's neurotransmitters that are creating the connections between synapses. Next slide, please. These are learning emotions, emotions that help students learn. First several on the left side, they have certain things in common. They are the wow emotions that hold students' attention, and also are bringing more and more neurotransmitters. We have humor, challenge, compassion, minor stress and mental discomfort, as in when students have to question their faulty mental models. Mild anger, mild sadness, when, let's say, students have to look at a situation that's unjust, unfair, or that really, you know, think that this is a pity that this is happening, but not major stress, trauma, or anxiety. Just the more milder varieties are very, very, very helpful to us. Next slide, please. These are emotionally evocative teaching methods. Interactive lectures, expressive lectures, engaging stories, cases, problems, engaging, of course, to our students, dramatic demonstrations, dramatic videos, dramatic presentations, and activities and assignments that have students consider multiple points of view. There can be a wow factor in it. There can be a mild mental discomfort factor in it. There can be a challenge factor in these as well. So next slide, please. Principle number 19. Students learn better when they have to produce answers and not just recognize correct ones. That is, when they expect to have to free recall material for like short essays or short answers or even longer essays. It's a good idea to have at least one essay on an exam, because students will study for the exam more deeply, because they know they will have to free recall material, that is, generate, produce material, and not just recognize it. And finally, the next slide, students learn better when they correct their errors, when we have them correct their errors, whether it be on homework, quizzes, or exams. when we make them learn by their mistakes. So instead of just marking a problem wrong, that's fine. We mark it wrong, or that's fine. But then we have to give students the chance, and maybe get half the points back, to learn how to do that problem correctly and do it correctly, or do the same problem correctly, or do a similar problem correctly. And this way they will learn to do the problems. If you just tell them they did it wrong, that doesn't mean they learn anything by it, does it? It doesn't. Next slide, please. This is a great exercise, and it's a self-regulated learning activity for after an exam, after a major exam, after the students get the graded exam back, to do a reflection on thinking about, okay, what's the difference between what you expected and what you actually performed, how you actually performed on the exam. How do you feel about that? If you're disappointed, perk up. How long did you study? Did you put enough time into studying? How did you study? Did your study strategies work well? Why did you lose points? And what will you do differently next time you study for an exam? Next slide. This is another way to get students especially to see patterns in the reasons why they might have lost points. So in this case, you've got them, let's say, different types of questions. They might see that, oh, I tended to lose points on multiple choice or on true false. Reason, why did I lose points? These are just four reasons, and they're just for examples. You can change them any way you want. But this way, if there are patterns to the reasons why students got answers incorrect, they will be able to identify these patterns and not repeat them. So that's the whole idea. This is learning by your mistakes, even if it's learning test strategies. But in any case, do have students correct their answers that they get wrong, or they're never going to learn how to do it right. Okay, we have a few minutes. Any questions? And I know that Andrea's been watching the chat. Do you have any questions that seem to come up again and again?
I don't have any questions on chat that I'm seeing right now, but anybody is welcome to unmute and ask a question or post on chat.
Sure. Any questions? I'm sure I couldn't have been perfectly clear. Or you might have a question, well, how can I adapt this to this sort of class?
Well, I will say, Dr. Nilson, you addressed a lot of the questions that we had in the first meeting.
Yes.
I noticed that. So that was, I guess you are perfect. You must have answered.
Oh, yeah, right. And one of the questions that came up at seemingly a few times earlier today had to do with applying this to online learning. And so I did try to address that, at least here and there, in the course of this presentation, and that's a very good question, a very, very good question, because sometimes the transfer across platforms is not at all obvious. And in a few cases, you really can't do it, practical purposes, you can't do it. Okay. Will there be a comprehensive final on this? Yes, there will. I should have told you at the beginning of the term, of course. The comprehensive final is what you do in classes, right? It's all application.
I guess Greg Binder was not multitasking. He was paying attention. He wasn't on his phone or distracted.
Excellent. Okay. Karen, do you have something to say? Any questions?
I want to thank you so much, Dr. Nilson. This has been such a fantastic presentation. It kept me interested twice today, so what can I say?
Good.
It was wonderful. I appreciate you taking the time to give this presentation to us. I know that our faculty members have benefited from it tremendously.
Well, it was my pleasure, and it was a real honor to be the first speaker in this symposium series. And really, I feel very privileged. So thank you, Karen, for all you did to make this happen. And Andrea, thanks to you as well, because you were definitely on the tech end of it all. And so I hope all of you can use this, at least some of the material in some ways. And I wish you all happy teaching.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nilson.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Patty.